Okay, we are here today as friends and brothers reading excellent texts in theology and then talking about those texts with each other. So welcome to Generous Theology. I'm Brock, and Chuck is joining me here. And Chuck, we have a chance at a part 2 in our chapter 26 here about history from the Oxford Handbook of Systematic Theology. And this is a chapter that has a lot to give. And we talked about some of the issues last week. I mentioned some high-level concerns. You talked about some of the ins and outs of what needs to be considered when we're engaging with the issues of history. And we both realized that there was still more that this chapter had to say. So let's pick up where we left off there. And Chuck, I think we had talked about, we were just maybe getting into this idea that histories are largely about content, but also largely about method. They're also about personalities and intensely people-driven. And so even though we have some ideas that things change in cultures as we go from, for example, in the Christian faith, we go from a Jewish Christianity very early to a Gentile-based Christianity that eventually becomes very rooted and based and grounded in the Greek culture of the Eastern Mediterranean. And then that adjusts with time through the centuries and becomes what will become later the Greek Orthodox Church, while at the same time, the Latin West comes online with something that is still fundamentally and basically Christian, but at the same point in time, it does have its unique individual differences. And Chuck, this is a lot to keep track of. And what do you want to emphasize when you're trying to think about a wholesome way to construct a historical view?
Yeah, one of the things that really struck me in this chapter was that the shift in historiography, the shift in the way that historians do history, write about history, study history, is perhaps in and of itself not problematic. The problem arises when certain of those changes either are done non-critically or in an imbalanced critically way, where certain types of ways of doing history are criticized and others are beyond criticism, or at least not subject to it. But also the fact that then, even within these different ways of doing history, there is difference between methods, and methods can vary, and there may be good reasons to try different methods to get to pull at certain themes or to pull at certain ideas that may not be as easy to pull at using other methods. But whether even in changing methods, if we are so embedded in particular directional ways of thinking about history, macro histories is the way that Professor Lyman puts it, that's going to have a huge impact. And sometimes it feels a little bit like that at times. And Lyman, I think, recognizes this, and she points this out in the chapter. But among some historians, there seems to be this thought that all we have to do is change the methods, and we don't have to worry about the underlying macro histories, and that just doesn't work. And so as an example of that, or in the section 2, whose story on social history, Professor Lyman tells about some changes in the way that history has done. They're retrieving some long ignored histories and challenging some perspectives and reshaping some more conventional historical narratives. But yet, even within doing that, political commitments were often woven into the evolving methodologies. In some cases, that prompted critical examination of some older objective histories, but in others, it didn't result in that change. And one thing I found interesting, for example, I was in a couple of bookstores yesterday. Went down to Milwaukee and spent some time in a nice independent bookstore, Boswell Books, down in downtown Milwaukee, where I often do a lot of my book shopping, where I can spend some time kind of browsing rather than just going online and trying to guess at stuff. And I have this tradition at Christmas time that I always buy 2 books for my children. They're adults now, but I still do this. But I always buy books that I think, A, they might enjoy, but B, that will push them a little bit, that will be a little challenging in one way or another. And it sometimes takes going into the bookstore to look at that, to do that. Well, anyway, they're both in Boswell Books, and then later we were up at the larger kind of outdoor shopping mall in Milwaukee on the east side there, and so it was also in the Barnes and Noble's books. And it struck me in the history section, how much of the history section is no longer your typical, here's the history of France, or here's the history of the Civil War, or here's the history of this particular presidential administration, or those kinds of things. But how so many history books today are more popular history. They tell they focus on a particular individual, or they focus on a particular institution, or one small piece of a culture that may go through a large period of time. Some of the more popular ones that I've seen, Mark Kurlansky is an author who has written, he did one on just salt and another one on cod, and he often writes on food. But then there I saw some others that were focused on certain types of magic, and others that were focused on certain types of sewing and textiles. And Professor Lyman points out that this kind of popular history, in some cases, was done as a way of buttressing certain preconceived political notions, and in other cases, it was done as a way of challenging it. And sometimes you get the sense that it's all one or the other. And she points out, for example, that some of the later popular history was written as a way of challenging what some historians thought had become this failed macro history of Marxism, where Marxism had been very popular among a large, particular segment anyway, of historians and historical writers. And Marxism especially is really hyper-focused on particular issues, economic relationships between people and governments, and between the wealthy and the poor, but often forgets about other relationships. And she points out, for example, a book from 80 that sounds really interesting to me, The Cheese and the Worms, The Cosmos of a 16th Century Miller, which was designed to avoid that failed macro history that thought that only economics is important. What's interesting to me in all of that is that it does seem in the last maybe 100, 200 years, in some ways there's been a revolution in the way we do history, but people often assume that revolution in and of itself changed things, and that's not necessarily the case. And that's a reminder, I think, to us as well as Christians, as we read histories, as we do church histories, or as we consider the role of history even in thinking about things like theology and philosophy, we need to not only think about the methods that are using. Are we doing a biographical history? Are we doing some kind of a topic that, of a popular event, of that kind of thing? Are we doing something that's more economic oriented or politically oriented? That not only do we have to think about those things, but then we have to determine within that, are particular worldviews being woven into that view? And merely changing styles is insufficient to guarantee that we're going to get at different views of things. And in many ways, it's just a good reminder that whenever we do history, we do have to pay attention as well to what are the base understandings, what are the core worldviews of those who are writing that history, and how is that going to impact on the decisions that are made in making that and doing that writing. I think a positive example of that, Professor Lyman talks about Justo Gonzalez. And Justo Gonzalez, I think, is perhaps most known for his 3-volume church history. But what was unique about Justo Gonzalez's church history, which I think is read in a lot of seminaries now, is that it is designed to be much more broad than the typical sort of Western Western church history that focuses first on the Church of Rome and then on the Reformation, and then things that happened in Northern Europe, and how does that impact then in the United States and North America. And Gonzalez talks about, look, there's a lot else going on around the world that has had an impact. You and I have talked a little bit about that even on our Monday conversations in reading Bavinck and in talking about how much of an impact in many ways Eastern Roman Christianity, Byzantine Christianity had. And even though Latin Christianity, the West, ended up in ascendancy, St. Augustine certainly brought in themes from both, and that may be what made him such a strong writer, and one that today we still rely very heavily on, was because he was able to bring in some of those concepts from those different views. And I think Gonzalez's church history as well is, maybe it's not on the level of Augustine, but it is, I think, one of the reasons you read it in so many different seminaries, including in very evangelical, very confessional, more mainline traditions. They're all reading it, is because what he's successful in having done is brought together a great deal of information from all around the world, expanded the view of what Christianity, what is happening in Christianity, without necessarily going in one or another particular direction as far as changing the basic worldview. He didn't go to a sort of a Marxist view that the church is really only a function of economic history and of the proletariat and the bourgeois. He didn't buy into, despite the fact that he spent a lot of time talking about the global South, he didn't get into sort of this liberationist sort of function where everything is just simply about, the whole history of the church is just simply about the haves and the have-nots, but rather he was able to gather a much bigger picture. And again, this is all, as we read history, as we read Christian history, it's just a reminder that I think we always have to go into it with our eyes open, understanding that folks who write history, they write it from the perspective that they have, and that it's worthwhile thinking about what is that perspective, what are the core beliefs that lie at the base of those who are writing those histories, and how is that going to impact on the conclusions they're going to have.
Thank you for that, Chuck. That's a beautiful overview of where we need to be thinking about the issues that this chapter is raising. Now, with respect to that, I'm glad you mentioned our studies with Bavinck, because just recently, in an earlier episode, you and I read a section in Bavinck's Reformed Dogmatics. I believe it was in Volume 1, I think it was Chapter 2, and there was an essay in that chapter entitled The Turn to the Subjective. And so we find here in Professor Lyman's essay a section entitled What Story? The Problem of Narrative and the Cultural Turn. And I think all of us can acknowledge great blessings and benefits from a disciplined study of history. But I think it's difficult for some of us to acknowledge that better is not always better. And of course, I need to qualify, what that might mean. What do you mean better isn't always better? Well, taking a step back and thinking about the landscape, I want to say there is every potential for many kinds of improvements today. Chuck, this could be a golden age. In terms of progression, in terms of progress and good things happening, we do have more manuscripts. We have more PhDs with better training than we have ever had in the West. And yet, there is also potential for regression and declension. You were in the bookstore and you were noticing how it's changed over the years. And some of that change seems very sensical and explainable with respect to the ideas of different fashions, different fads in reading coming about. And it is not merely a declension to be different. There are ways, of course, in which the way things, quote unquote, were when you and I were younger in the bookstores could be considered better than now. One thing we have to admit is that they're different. And I think with that, we can say there's good, there's bad. What are some of the issues that at a high level, I think are most potentially in place to lead not to a golden age, but to lead to regression and declension? I think the first thing that comes to my mind reading this chapter is this idea of a new sheriff in town. So the challenge of modernity in terms of broad market share, mind share, it really looks like the secular phenomenologist reigns as the default priest, for lack of a better word, of the new era. Very oftentimes, what has come before is categorized, and much is dismissed by appealing to an Overton window of acceptability. And so much of what came before has been labeled as narrow, dogmatic, hagiographic, partisan. And while these words can be used properly in some specific senses, we are finding that just like banks find it prudent to keep bags of money behind bars so that bank robbers don't have easy access to just come in and walk off with customer funds, so too we find that is the same thing now with narratives. In the past, we had maybe, let's say, an open space to talk about many different kinds of narratives. And now with the introduction of these policy shaping, thought shaping, mind share shaping tendencies that institutions have, they really are using these Overton windows to really lock down on what is quote unquote acceptable or not acceptable in society to talk about. And that includes here in history. So just one example in our lifetime, very fair example. What is a woman? Well, there's a lot of controversy now. And most of what's being driven in the culture is a form of soft power, a narrative structure in which the traditional view and understanding of what a woman is being placed entirely outside of a window of acceptability. Now, is that good? Is that bad? Well, I would say let's have the discussion, but when one side isn't even allowed to participate at the table, having a discussion is really just one side holding the other side, the position at bay. And so now we have lots of new buzzwords: scientific worldviews, evidential-based worldviews, realistic, this idea of a default worldview that has to be, for the sake of fairness, not religious. We mentioned what is a woman. I think of some other areas where the Overton window and this soft power has changed what is quote unquote acceptable in society. I think of monetary theory. We used to speak about sound money very frequently. And while no one school dominated, there were many groups that were interested in providing for the common. And so we speak, it's a well understood principle, the tragedy of the commons, which refers back to this concept that forces for the public good tend to be exploited by special interests, and the public good is actually very often greatly harmed. Now, it's a complicated situation, and I'm not trying to minimize that, but the way that sound money advocates were diminished from monetary theories and what's being taught today and what's considered acceptable. Hear things, for example, I hear economics professors and economists talking about, well, as this nation strives to move forward, one thing is clear: austerity is not an option. And so that's an example. What's going to happen in the economy of nation X? Well, whatever it's going to be, it can't be smaller government. It can't be less spending. It can't be less printing of sovereign debt. And so there's an old expression: it's not the outcome of the vote that matters, it's who counts the votes. And so we are in a situation that has every indication of falling into such a declension. Voting integrity, for example, is a big issue right now. And without pointing fingers, without making indictments, without offering a full, in-depth and detailed analysis, it should be pretty clear that democratic republics can and do end when a majority of its citizens are convinced that the vote is rigged. And so I say all this alarm, not just as a point of being partisan, but just to say there are really big issues here. And while bigger has every potential to be better, it's not clear that that's always going to translate. In fact, there are reasons to think it might not. I was talking with a dear friend of mine who, unlike myself, representing a Christian worldview, my friend represented a pagan, non-believing worldview. And we were talking about, and I said, boy, we are so blessed in the West to have the fruits of the 16th and 17th century tradition of law that came about in Great Britain, in England, and its Christian origins and Christian roots. And my friend said, no, you've got it all wrong. We're not a Christian society. All of those good things that are in the law today came about from pre-Christian Greece and pre-Christian Rome. And so I thought, wow, that was a really telling example of how narrative really can dominate and can have the tendency to destroy. So I'm on social media discussion groups, and there's a meme that goes around, and it has a timeline of history and an arrow that goes from left to right, and it's showing progress in human history as if it were, for example, let's say a stock or a bond, a financial instrument that would move up and down as things would get better or worse in the world, generally speaking. And so this meme presented a timeline, and it showed a big gap where human flourishing went from a high down to a low, almost to a zero, and stayed there for a long period of time. And of course, that was referring to the 1,000 years from the fall of Rome to, roughly speaking, the start of the Renaissance and the Enlightenment. And there was an arrow describing that gap, and it said, here are the Christian Dark Ages. And so, of course, the narrative theme was this: look how much progress we've lost because of the detour to Christianity. And so narrative streams, their value to persuade, their value to inform, and even their value to perhaps misinform almost cannot be overstated, Chuck. And I think that's really concerning and makes Professor Lyman's analysis all the more valuable. Where would you go with the essay with those factors in mind?
Yeah, it's interesting. She spends some time in this section on narrative and the cultural turn, walking through a little bit of that more modern or more recent history of historiography, of the practice of history. And she starts with the hermeneutic of suspicion, right? And this really goes to Nietzsche, looks back at some of his comments in the use and abuse of history, the fact that historical theorists needed to be conscious of social power and those kinds of issues, to be suspicious of everything that's handed down because it may be tied into this social power. There is a somewhat of a move away from that hermeneutic of suspicion as it was perhaps in the late 19th century, but yet she also talks about a new historicism, and this new historicism being an attempt to practice some concepts relating to how do we look at a text, and how do we understand language, and what does that reflect? What kind of reality does that reflect? And is there a disconnect between our own understanding of what may have happened in the past and those who were present in the past, because we don't have the same language per se, or the same sort of cultural assumptions, those kinds of things. And there's a part of that hermeneutic of suspicion, that new historicism, that has some value, right? There is value in looking back and testing and questioning. But then the question really becomes, well, how do you do that questioning, and what do you replace it with? If you've determined that there are issues, have you predetermined how you're going to replace some of the concepts, some of the conclusions that historians have come to? And is there even, more radically, is there even a way to understand the past other than on our own terms? Is there a real past? And Lyman points out that to some extent, this new historicism has almost turned into the same hermeneutic of suspicion, but without the self-criticism that was necessary to make sure that we weren't ourselves putting in our own assumptions into things. And she pointed out that realistically, because in a way you have to, most historians really do believe that there is a past reality that existed, that exists today. It's a past reality, but it happened, that is outside of a text or interpretation, even if we can't completely retrieve it all. And yet we sometimes act like that doesn't exist, that there is no such thing. One of the things that I find really interesting then is, if we're going to act like the only way that we can think about history is on our own terms, and if we're going to be suspicious of anything that gets handed down to us, well, then are we going to exercise that same suspicion, that same questioning, even of our own ways of thinking, even of our own worldviews, our own sort of base ways of thinking, and the base things that we hold to be absolutely true? And it does seem like that there's two directions. that historians have gone. And these two directions are going to be very familiar to people who've listened to you and I talk, Brock, about 19th century philosophy, because I think we saw the give and take between these two things in that, and when we did that history. One side is the very rationalist, often very empiricist way of looking at things. It could be rational primarily in that we have to think logically about conclusions, but it could also be rational in more of an empiricist way, where we're only going to base our conclusions on things that we can test, that we can see, and nothing beyond that. The problem with that is the loss of the transcendent. The problem also then becomes, well, what becomes ultimate truth? What becomes ultimate reality? And for many empiricists, ultimate reality, because there's not necessarily the belief in the transcendent, and therefore because of that, there's no belief in a God who created history, who upholds it, who still has some level of impact on it, controls that history, but also upholds people living within that history. If you can't, because you're an empiricist, you can't accept that kind of transcendent creator, well, then naturally the human himself becomes the only basis for what is your key view, and making the human, and especially the individual, the very center of all things, really is going to skew how you do history. And there is a sense in which we don't question that anymore. We don't question that sort of empirical or rationalist approach. Now, there does seem to be another way to go, and that's some of this postmodern way of looking at history, which is more irrational. It maybe is somewhat more akin to some of the romantics of the 19th century. But even in that kind of way of thinking, there is typically a center for where are we still going to get our truth from? Where is truth in a more irrational or a more romantic type way of thinking and a way of doing history? And what we've seen is it often comes down to ideology, and it can be different kinds of ideology. It can be a capitalist Western liberal ideology. It can be a Marxist ideology. It can be a sort of a identity-based, gender or race-based way of thinking. But what happens then is, if we put all of our eggs in that basket, we're often not seeing beyond that. And we're stuck in the same trap that the rationalists, that the empiricists are stuck in, because they're unwilling to consider that there is truth beyond those core narratives, the narratives of rich and poor, or the narrative of the worker and the bourgeois, as in Marxism, or the narrative of the Homo economicus, as in sort of Western liberal capitalism. There's an unwillingness to question those things. One place where I've seen it, it's interesting. I've talked in our discussions fairly often lately about the author Brian Fikkert. Brian Fikkert he teaches down at Covenant College in Lookout Mountain, Georgia. He's an economics professor. It's a Christian college. And then he works also with the Chalmers Center, which does a lot of work in thinking about and working with impoverished communities, both in North America and around the world, and thinking about the best ways to help those in poverty. He's known for his books, When Helping Hurts, Becoming Whole, those kinds of books. And one of the interesting exercises that he has people reading his books go through is a way of sort of recognizing how we've often baked in, even as Christians, we've often baked in certain of these assumptions about the world that ignore the transcendence of God. He talks about Western naturalism, and how Western naturalism makes this assumption that there is nothing besides the human, and so the whole goal of life, therefore, must be just for the individual human to gather all that they can, and flourishing means that they get everything that they can, and they have all this stuff, and a lot of times in poverty alleviation that's done in Western countries, it's really about just allowing the impoverished to have more stuff. But poverty is about much more than stuff. We are not Homo economicus. We Western naturalism makes this assumption that that's all who we are. We're just bodies. We don't have souls. We're not spiritual, and so all we need is stuff for our bodies. But that doesn't work. And he points out that as Christians, we've often partially bought into that view. And he, I don't know if he coined the term, but he talks about how so many Christians today live what he calls a Christian Gnosticism. And he describes that as on Sunday, in our spiritual lives, we separate out our spiritual lives, our Sundays, and that's all about getting to heaven, right? And it's all about our souls are separate from our bodies. And someday our souls will get to heaven, and to heck with our bodies. We don't need to worry about that. So church isn't going to deal with that kind of stuff. Who cares about deacons helping the poor? Who cares about getting involved in issues of justice? Because that's all going to go away anyway. We're all going to get to heaven. And then the other 6 days of the week, we just live as Western naturalists, Homo economicus. And for those 6 days of the week, we're just going to live like every other pagan in the Western world and try to get all that we can. And then he points out how even Christians doing poverty alleviation around the world buy into these narratives. And so I think what Lyman does here, and what I think people like Brian Fickert have done in some of their writing, is point out that just because you're going to make a shift in your narrative doesn't mean that you've ended buying into specific worldviews that need to be challenged. And as Christians, we would want to challenge any of those worldviews that ignore the presence of a creator and creatures, and what that relationship entails, and how the fact that as humans we are more than mere flesh. We're not just bodies, but we have souls as well. Our minds and our wills are tied to that, and we're one. It's not like our bodies are here and our souls are there, and when we die and go to heaven, it's just going to be our souls. Forget about our bodies. And bodies is just something temporary. But those kinds of assumptions that Christians sometimes buy into are basically taken from the pagan world around us. And I think Lyman, while she's maybe not making the point in the same way, I think as I read through, especially this third section on the problem of narrative and the cultural turn, it became so obvious to me that in one sense that's what she's doing as well, is warning that we still end up buying into some of these narratives that are not the narratives of Christianity. And certainly I understand that there can be some variety in how Christians even end up thinking about things. There are Christians who buy into that democracy is bad, and sowing questions about how does our voting system work as a way of overthrowing our modern democratic system. There are Christians who believe that the current democratic system is the best one, and so that kind of sowing that's going on by some in society, and questioning and creating narratives out of thin air about stolen elections and things like that's problematic for Christians to be involved with. And I get that. There's people on both sides of those things. But what we really ought to be doing is, as we think about the narratives that we've created or the narratives that we buy into, not so much just testing them with whether it's ideological tests, whether it's tests, whether it's tests that are of scientific certainty that only get into sort of what we can touch and what we can see and what we can test, but that we really need to test them against something much larger, which is the Christian, the key Christian narrative of the gospel and of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. And yeah, Lyman doesn't say that specifically, and she might not even go as far as that. I don't know, but certainly that's the conclusion that I take, that I create out of reading this, is that we as Christians need to be much more careful about how we approach historical narratives, and making sure that we don't buy into narratives that are different from the truth. And the truth really is also in some ways a a particular narrative. It's just the narrative of truth. It's the narrative of the gospel. It's the narrative of God as creator and humans as creatures. It's the narrative of sin and the impact that that's had on all of humanity, and the need for redemption and the restoration that's brought about by relationship with God and Christ's work. And that always needs to be a part of what we do, whether it's, as Fickert points out, in our poverty alleviation work. We can't ignore those kinds of narratives of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. But we also can't do that. We can't ignore those things in our history, in our theology, in our philosophy, really in anything that we do as Christians in this world.
Thank you for that, Chuck. I appreciate that people are identifying the problems even as they are living them out. So put another way, here I am bringing a list of objections related to the challenge of modernity in the Christian West. But a person educated in these historical understandings, these deconstructions and reconstructions, can find it very easy to say, haha, this is just coming from a particular position, a privileged position, a partisan position, a dogmatic position, one that is outside where we need to be. And then I can make a criticism looking on that says, aha, that in itself was a dogmatic, pre-critical, deconstructionist, reconstructionist approach from another partisan. And at the end of the day, Chuck, we can both be stopping up our ears like I did on the playground when I was a school child and saying to the other person, nanny, nanny, boo, boo, I'm not listening to you. So there is that tendency and that danger to be overcome. I think, though, there are forces that can push in the other direction. If there's one thing that has occurred in the last 200, 250 years, there really has been some of the best outcomes associated with mixed society. What do I mean by that? So even as the moderns have challenged the Christians and the Christians have challenged the modernists, and some modernists have become Christian and some Christians have become modernists, and other things have happened as well, we have to say that when we look back at this time, this is at least a time in which such opposition can be discussed and we can have these arguments in a fairly robust session. So what we're not doing is we're not doing something that was very popular previously, which is to say, citizens ruthlessly stamped out opposing thought in societies prior to the Renaissance, prior to the modern period. It was very difficult for non-party line, so heterodox ideas within a culture to grab hold, even if they would ultimately be positive by certain measures and standards. And so one of the things that I think has gone well is, by and large, we have managed to live together in a mixed society in a genteel way. And that does have to count for something, Chuck. And so while I'm concerned over the long-term future of the West as it moves from being a Christian West into a post-Christian West, and as the Christian part of the West moves from being a biblical-centered Christianity into an extra-biblical Christianity. So the long-term outlook seems dim, but I can say in the short to medium term that that's not the whole story. And by the way, long-term outlooks are a lot harder to get right than short-term outlooks. And short-term outlooks are extremely hard. So predicting the future is very difficult. So I'm not trying to be a doomsayer. I'm not trying to spell the end of all wholesomeness unless everybody agrees with me and votes my way in the next election. But I think what's important to see here is that the people who are so able to point out and have a critical awareness in their analysis of others, like you said, this was beautiful when you said this, have to have that same skill at almost that same level when thinking about one's own self-evaluation. And I suppose that's a highfalutin way of trying to say that we have to be mature. In other words, me partisanly looking at you and saying, haha, you're outside the bounds of what is acceptable, so you're out. I need to be more self-aware of what I'm doing when I do such a thing. And usually what makes people self-aware is when that very thing is done to them. And I feel at a loss here, Chuck, I feel like we've declined and regressed in large part because of the blessings that have come to the Christian West over the last 500 years. We've had prosperity, we've had improvements in sanitation, in quality of life, in food quality, in medicine, in the sciences. We've been able to build such a society that to some degree we allow people to exist who would not have existed under earlier regimes and situations, and praise God for that blessing. But it also means that there are perhaps unsanitary ideas of morality that float around, that get a hearing, that grow. If we see Western society as a body, the prospect of a cancer in the body is a serious one. And so I think we need essays like this one from Professor Lyman. Even if we're not in full agreement that this particular mode is the right mode or that particular discipline is the right one, I think that we can agree with the professor that the kinds of issues that come up here in history really do have an impact, and they really are important. So in that sense, this is a very positive chapter. Let me throw it over to you, Chuck, for some final thoughts.
I agree with you that this is, in the end, a very positive chapter because there is much that can be gleaned from it. And there are some important questions that I think need to be asked and need to be answered about what does this all mean for Christians, and especially for Christians who are doing history, but also Christians who are doing theology and philosophy, because all these things. One of the reasons that history is in this particular section is that the way that we do history, the way that we talk about history, the way we understand history, really does play a major role in how we do our theology and how do we think about our dogmatics, how do we think about our systematic theology. If we completely change our view of history, it's likely to change our view of philosophy and of theology. And we need to engage with these things. We can't just be the ostrich with the head in the sand or cover the ears and go la 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 la, like you described that sometimes people are want to do. But in engaging, we also then need to make sure that we engage in ways that those things that need to be preserved, things that need to be questioned, and don't lose sight of the core narrative of the gospel. At the very end, Lyman, and again, she doesn't get into sort of the conclusions that you and I have talked about the ways that we do this, but I think she also points out how history and the way we think of history is tied into our way of doing philosophy and our way of doing theology. She says history as a conceptual problem and a practice shares with theology the provisional nature of its task, therefore can be put into an important dialogue. Histories, like experiences, bring in the particular human condition, which is a legitimate and necessary part of theological reflection as part of the material and personal relationship to God. And the successful story in the end is founded on both persuasion and illumination, and historical practices have for centuries attempted to include both persuasion and illumination. And that illumination piece is one we can't forget. Humility and dialogue can be shared professional virtues for historians and theologians. And I love that part. Humility and dialogue can be shared professional virtues for historians and theologians. It's worthwhile to be having dialogue, even with those with whom we share significant differences. It is also important to be humble about what we do know. I think as Christians, we should naturally be that way. As Christians, we believe that we're certainly affected by our sin, and that the only perfection that we experience in this world is that of God, and that Christ imputes to us, but that we don't fully receive even in this life. And so it should be natural for us to be humble, even though sometimes as Christians we aren't particularly humble. But I just love that she puts it that way. And it reminds me, again, going back to, you and I have referred several times now to the work that we've done discussing Herman Bavinck and his Reformed dogmatics, and it takes me back to that as well. We've spent quite a bit of time in the last couple of months thinking about the history of Christianity in terms of Reformed dogmatics. And the reason for that is because when we do our theology, when we study dogmatics, that history also plays a role in how we do that, and it has an impact. And I think even our discussion last week or the last couple of weeks on Augustine and ways that people sometimes treat Augustine, concerns that people have about hagiography, but also understandings that we have of the huge impact that Augustine has had on a wide variety of Christians. Just the fact that we had those discussions gives some strength to Lyman's conclusions here that shared work of history and theology and how they engage with each other is going to be really important. So I'm glad that we read this chapter, and I'm glad that we got 2 weeks, in fact, to spend time discussing what Professor Lyman had to say. And thank you for being a part of that with me.